A cargo ship crossing the Atlantic could carry shells, fuel, truck parts, or bridge equipment. And yet in the middle of the Second World War, the United States used some of that precious shipping space to move Coca-Cola bottling plants. Not bottles alone, entire plants. To a German staff officer trained to think in tonnage, that could look absurd. Why spend scarce cargo capacity on something that killed nobody? That question opens a much larger story. German officers were not ignorant of American industrial power. They could read the production figures. They knew the United States was launching ships, building aircraft, rolling steel, and turning out vehicles on a scale Germany could not easily match. The harder thing to understand was what America chose to spend that abundance on. Again and again, the United States devoted money, shipping, administrative effort, and industrial capacity to things that did not fire a weapon. A soft drink, a letter from home, aptitude testing, training pipelines, replacement bridges, and eventually the return of bodies after the war was over. None of those choices makes the American war effort morally clean. The same military remained segregated. Its personnel system could punish men for poor schooling. Rifle companies absorbed replacements under brutal conditions. American power carried its own hypocrisies and failures. But those contradictions make the deeper pattern more important, not less. The United States was building a war machine around a costly assumption. People had to be found, trained, supplied, reassured, reassigned, repaired, and, when possible, returned. That was a different kind of total war. A German officer's institutional experience pushed in another direction. The state mobilized by extraction. It requisitioned labor, controlled food, directed industry, and measured endurance by how much more could be taken from society before the front failed. Germany also possessed highly trained professional officers, skilled engineers, and efficient organizations. The point is not that German institutions lacked competence. The point is that competence operated inside a system with fewer political and ideological reasons to spend scarce resources on the individual when those resources appeared to compete with the state. That distinction is easy to miss because the visible weapons dominate photographs. A tank can be counted, a bomber can be counted, a bottle of Coke, a microfilmed letter, a classification score, or a railroad car carrying a coffin looks peripheral. But when those peripheral things appear again and again, they become evidence of what the larger machine was designed to preserve. Start with the bottling plants. In 1941, Coca-Cola's leadership publicly committed to selling a bottle to an American in uniform for 5 cents wherever he was serving, regardless of what it cost the company to get it there. Military production received a sugar rationing exemption. Then the company sent bottling equipment overseas. Roughly 64 plants were assembled abroad, and something on the order of 5 billion bottles were served to American personnel during the war. In 1943, Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters in North Africa requested bottling equipment and millions of bottles. Look at that request as a shipping problem. Every crate had weight. Every machine needed space. Every bottle had to travel through a logistics network already carrying ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and men. The easy conclusion is that the drink was a luxury. The military conclusion was different. Familiarity had value. Routine had value. A soldier who could taste something from home, receive mail from home, and believe that the system behind him still knew he was a person might function differently from a soldier treated only as a replaceable body at the front. That logic becomes even clearer in the mail system. The United States did not simply accept that letters were too bulky for wartime transport. It changed the physical form of the letter. Families and service members wrote on standardized forms. The pages were photographed onto 16mm microfilm. The film crossed the ocean. At the destination, the images were printed back onto paper at reduced size and delivered. It was called V-mail. More than 500 million pieces moved through the system, on top of ordinary wartime mail. A sack of paper letters might weigh around 50 pounds. The same messages reduced to film could weigh only a small fraction of that. So the United States built an industrial information pipeline for private emotion. That is the strange part. A mother's note, a wife's bad news, a child's drawing copied into a letter, or a few sentences from a hometown were not weapons. Yet the state spent technology and organization to keep those messages moving without surrendering the cargo space needed for war. The system was not sentimental in any simple way. Mail could destroy morale as easily as restore it. Men received news of deaths, debts, divorces, and families they could not help. Censors could read what passed through the network. But the network existed because morale itself had been treated as something that could be supplied. Germany also maintained military mail, and early in the war, its field post system could function well. The problem came as transport networks were broken and the Reich's communication system deteriorated. By late 1944, soldiers on the Western Front could wait long periods for news from cities being bombed at home. The contrast was not that one army cared and the other did not. It was that one system still possessed the material depth to spend on the connection. And that matters because logistics is not only the movement of explosives. It is the movement of whatever keeps an organization coherent. A letter cannot repair a truck or stop a shell. But an army is not a warehouse of equipment. It is millions of people repeatedly asked to do difficult things far from home. The American system spent weight, electricity, clerks, aircraft space, printing equipment, and time on keeping those people tied to a life outside the war. The same logic appeared before a man ever reached a unit. Over the course of the war, roughly 9 million American men took the Army General Classification Test. It was a written exam, around 40 minutes long, covering areas such as vocabulary, arithmetic reasoning, and spatial relationships. The score placed a man into a classification that could influence what the Army tried to do with him. High scorers might be steered toward technical training, signals, ordnance, aircrew programs, or officer candidate school. Roughly 300,000 men became officers through wartime officer candidate programs. The regular Army mocked some of them as 90-day wonders. The important point is not that the system worked perfectly. It did not. The test measured education as well as underlying ability. Men from poor or rural backgrounds could be penalized for the schooling they had never received. The Army also drew many of its highest scorers away from infantry units, while the infantry was the branch most likely to absorb heavy casualties. Senior officers complained that the classification machinery was stripping talent from the rifle companies that needed it. That criticism mattered because it exposed the cost of the system's own assumptions. Still, the scale of the attempt was remarkable. The Army was trying to examine millions of ordinary citizens and identify useful abilities before assigning them. It assumed talent might exist anywhere in the population and that the state should search for it. This was not simply a personnel procedure. It was an industrial hunt for human capability. The German Army also cared deeply about selection and training, especially inside its professional officer corps. But its model began with institutions that selected candidates into established military pathways. The American classification system attempted something broader and messier. Take a mass citizen army, test men by the millions, and search for usable talent before the institution already knew where that talent was located. Its flaws were serious, but the scale of the search reveals the assumption behind it. Human ability was not supposed to remain invisible merely because it arrived without pedigree. That hunt widened when the labor shortage became severe. Before the war, about 12 million American women were in paid employment. By 1944, the figure was roughly 19 million. Women entered aircraft plants, shipyards, ordnance factories, offices, depots, and machine shops. Around 350,000 served in uniform through organizations that included the Women's Army Corps, the Navy's WWII, and the nursing services. Roughly 1,100 women served as WASP pilots, ferrying military aircraft inside the United States. The contrast with Germany needs care. German women already worked in large numbers before the war. The difference was not that German women stayed universally outside the labor force while American women suddenly entered it. The sharper difference came when Germany's manpower crisis deepened. Albert Speer pressed for broader compulsory mobilization of German women for armaments work. Hitler resisted the scale of mobilization Speer wanted. Instead, the Reich increasingly filled labor shortages with foreign workers and prisoners of war. By 1944, roughly 7.5 million foreign laborers and prisoners were working inside Germany, many under coercion and many under brutal conditions. That comparison reveals two different answers to the same wartime question. Where do you get more labor when the men are gone? One system expanded the paid participation of its own citizens while adjusting social roles under pressure. The other depended heavily on coerced labor drawn from conquered Europe while preserving ideological boundaries inside the Reich. The difference was not merely efficiency. It was a theory of what people were for. That does not mean American mobilization was frictionless or equal. Wartime labor still operated inside racial discrimination, unequal pay, family strain, and enormous social pressure. But the state and industry were willing to revise who could perform work that had previously been coded as male. In a total war, that flexibility became another form of capacity. Then came the bridges. March 1945. The Rhine stood between Allied armies and the interior of Germany. German planning treated the river as a barrier that could buy time if the crossings were destroyed. At Remagen on March 7th, American troops found the Ludendorff Railway Bridge still standing after a failed demolition attempt and seized it. That was luck. What followed was engineering. American engineers pushed pontoon bridging across the Rhine under fire and air attack. One tactical floating bridge was completed in roughly a day and a half, followed by additional crossings. When the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed on March 17th, killing engineers working on it, the crossing no longer depended on that single structure. That is the operational lesson. A destroyed bridge is only a decisive obstacle if the enemy needs the bridge you destroy. The American system had invested in prefabricated bridging, specialized engineer units, transport training, and the logistics needed to bring replacement crossings forward. German demolitions could still delay movement, create danger, and force work under fire. But a river crossing could be rebuilt as a process rather than treated as a single irreplaceable object. This is what abundance looked like when converted into organization. Not only more tanks, more ways to recover from the loss of the thing the enemy expected you to need. Across the Rhine front in March 1945, Allied engineers created multiple crossings. The operational value was not that any single bridge was magical. It was redundancy. A demolition could remove one route, but trained engineer units, bridging equipment, transport, and traffic control could create another. The German defense still imposed cost and delay. What it could no longer reliably do was turn every destroyed bridge into a long strategic pause. That is a different kind of industrial power. Not a warehouse full of replacement objects, but an organization practiced at replacing lost functions. And then the American system reached its ugliest contradiction. Around 1.25 million African Americans served in the United States Armed Forces during the Second World War. They served inside a military segregated by regulation. Black soldiers could be restricted to support roles by assumptions about ability that the institution itself would later abandon. They faced separate facilities, limited opportunities, unequal treatment, and a command structure shaped by the racism of the country they were serving. Yet their labor and combat performance were essential. Black truck drivers helped sustain the Red Ball Express. The 761st Tank Battalion fought with Patton's Third Army. The 302nd Fighter Group built the combat record associated with the Tuskegee Airmen. During the Ardennes crisis, when the Army needed infantry replacements, Black volunteers stepped forward for provisional platoons serving alongside white units. Nazi propaganda seized on American segregation for obvious reasons. And here the propaganda did not need to invent the contradiction. There were cases in the American South in which German prisoners of war could be served in places where the Black American soldiers guarding them could not enter as equal customers. That happened inside the country fighting a regime built around racial hierarchy. No serious account should soften it. But the contradiction did not remain silent. Black newspapers attacked segregation. Black service members challenged the rules around them. Courts, politicians, officers, veterans, and activists fought over what citizenship meant after men had worn the uniform abroad. In July 1948, 3 years after the war, President Harry Truman signed the executive order directing equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed services and setting the military on the path toward desegregation. That did not erase what Black Americans had endured during the war. It showed something else. An institution could be forced to argue with its own rules. There was no straight line from wartime service to justice. Executive action in 1948 did not instantly remove segregation from every unit or erase discrimination from American life. The significance lies in the existence of a mechanism for public challenge. Soldiers, families, newspapers, courts, activists, politicians, and military studies could force the contradiction into the open and make the institution answer it. For German observers steeped in a system that treated ideology as something to enforce rather than publicly contest, that kind of contradiction could look like weakness. In practice, the ability to expose a contradiction created a path, however incomplete and delayed, for correction. And that brings the story to the decision that had no battlefield payoff at all. The war was over. The men were already dead. Nothing about what happened next could change the outcome of a campaign. After the war, the United States contacted the next of kin of service members buried overseas and offered a choice. The family could leave the dead in permanent American cemeteries near the places where they had fallen, or the government would bring them home at public expense for burial where the family chose. The scale was enormous. Roughly 171,000 American war dead were returned to the United States between 1947 and 1951, while roughly 93,000 remained overseas at the request of their families. In October 1947, One of the first major repatriation ships entered New York Harbor carrying more than 6,000 caskets. Think about what that required after victory had already been declared. Identification, disinterment, caskets, ships, ports, rail schedules, honor guards. Paperwork connecting one set of remains to one family and one hometown. The same state that had once converted letters into microfilm to save cargo space now used ships to move the dead across oceans. There was no tactical return on that investment. No division became stronger because of it. No enemy was deterred. No bridgehead expanded. The military value was zero. The human value was the entire point. Families who chose not to repatriate their dead were not choosing abandonment. Their relatives remained in permanent American cemeteries overseas, maintained near the places where they had died. The extraordinary feature was the choice itself. The government did not impose one answer on every family. It asked the next of kin which burden they wanted the state to carry. That is why German estimates of American power could be numerically accurate and still miss something fundamental. Steel tonnage mattered. Aircraft production mattered. Shipyards mattered. Trucks, fuel, ammunition, and food mattered. But production alone did not explain the system. The United States kept spending part of its industrial advantage on the people inside that system, testing what they might be able to do, opening new labor roles when manpower ran short, carrying pieces of home across oceans, rebuilding crossings when infrastructure failed, arguing publicly over the rights of soldiers it was treating unequally, and continuing to spend money on families after the fighting had ended. None of that proves moral superiority in every action. It does show a strategic habit. American abundance was repeatedly converted into resilience by refusing to treat people as the cheapest component in the machine. Germany's war economy, especially as defeat closed in, moved in the opposite direction. Coerced labor expanded. Civilian and military losses became harder to replace. Transport collapsed. Ideology narrowed the choices available to the regime. By the end, the state had fewer material options and kept demanding more from human beings who had less left to give. Both societies mobilized on a vast scale. Both used propaganda. Both imposed sacrifice. Both sent young people into terrifying circumstances. But they did not spend their resources according to the same theory. One of the clearest pieces of evidence arrived after the war, when there was no longer any strategic reason to keep the machinery running. A train stopped at a hometown station with a flag-draped casket inside. For that family, the war finally ended where they chose.